Hey guys, tonight let's slow things down a little. Dim the lights, get comfortable, unclench your jaw, because we're drifting back to ancient Macedonia, to a time when people thought destiny was genetic, horses were basically personality tests, and one very intense young man decided that the known world sounded a bit small. This is Alexander the Great. Yes, that Alexander, the conqueror, the legend, the guy who made it to history textbooks by age 32 and then promptly stopped existing, which is honestly a very Alexander way to go about things. But before he was great, before he was conquering anything at all, he was just a kid, a deeply privileged, constantly supervised, emotionally complicated kid. And like most historical disasters, it all starts with the parents. Alexander was born in 356 BCE in Pella, the capital of Macedonia. His father was King Philip II, a brilliant military reformer, a ruthless politician, and a man who believed that diplomacy was best conducted at spear point. Philip was also missing an eye, walked with a limp, and had enough battle scars to qualify as a walking warning label. He was charismatic, loud, endlessly confident, and extremely busy conquering nearby territories, which meant he was also extremely busy not being emotionally present. Alexander's mother was Olympias, and if Philip was loud and physical, Olympias was intense and spiritual, and deeply convinced that the gods were personally involved in her son's existence. She claimed descent from Achilles, she kept snakes, she participated in mystery cults, and she told young Alexander, frequently, that he was destined for greatness. Not in a gentle, supportive way, more in a "you are not like other children and the universe expects results" way. So Alexander grew up with a father who conquered cities for fun, and a mother who whispered that Zeus himself may have stopped by his crib. A perfectly healthy emotional environment. No pressure at all. From a young age, Alexander was focused. He was intelligent, curious, competitive, and very aware that his father was famous. Philip's victories were public, celebrated, sung about, which meant Alexander grew up watching the world applaud someone else. There's a story, possibly exaggerated but very on brand, where Philip celebrates a major victory and Alexander, still a teenager, sulks because there will be nothing left for him to conquer. Normal teen stuff. Philip noticed Alexander's intensity early, and instead of discouraging it, he leaned in. Alexander received the best education available, including tutoring from Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle. So while other kids were learning basic literacy, Alexander was being taught philosophy, science, ethics, and how to debate like someone who absolutely will not be told no. Aristotle emphasized Greek superiority, logic, order. Alexander absorbed it all, and then immediately began dreaming of conquering non-Greeks, which is a very Alexander move. One of the most famous stories from his childhood involves a horse named Bucephalus. The horse was wild, unmanageable, too expensive to fail quietly. Philip was ready to give up on it. Alexander noticed that the horse was afraid of its own shadow, so he turned it toward the sun, calmed it, and rode it successfully. Philip allegedly cried and said, "My boy, seek a kingdom worthy of yourself," which is a great line and also an absolutely irresponsible thing to say to a child. But from that moment on, Alexander believed two things very strongly. One, he was special. Two, obstacles were just misunderstandings waiting to be corrected by confidence. As Alexander grew older, tensions at court grew sharper. Philip had multiple wives because kings did that. Olympias was not thrilled. When Philip married a younger Macedonian woman named Cleopatra, yes, different Cleopatra, things got ugly. At the wedding banquet, a drunken relative made comments about producing a legitimate heir. Alexander insulted him. Philip tried to attack Alexander. Philip tripped. Everyone watched, which is a moment that really tells you everything you need to know about this family. Olympias left. Alexander left with her. Eventually, they reconciled because politics, but the damage was done. Alexander knew his position was fragile. He was the heir, but heirs could be replaced. So when Philip was assassinated in 336 BCE, stabbed during a public event, Alexander moved fast, very fast. At 20 years old, Alexander became king and immediately began eliminating rivals. Potential claimants were executed. Enemies were warned. Greek city-states that considered rebelling were reminded, firmly, that Macedonia was not taking suggestions. The city of Thebes rebelled. Alexander destroyed it, completely. The message was clear. This was not a gentle king. But it's important to keep the sleepy tone here. Alexander didn't see himself as cruel. He saw himself as necessary. He believed order required force, that destiny didn't wait, and that hesitation was basically a personal insult. Once Greece was secure, Alexander turned east, because that's where the real glory was. The Persian Empire, huge, ancient, wealthy, and in Alexander's mind, overdue for leadership change. His father, Philip, had planned to invade Persia. Alexander simply inherited the idea and added urgency. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed into Asia with around 35,000 troops, which was not that many. The Persian Empire had vastly more resources, more soldiers, more territory, but it also had internal issues, satraps arguing, leadership problems, and Alexander had momentum. His first major battles went surprisingly well. He led charges personally. He took risks. He was wounded more than once. This was part of his brand. He didn't command from the back. He was right there, which made his soldiers adore him and terrified everyone else. He defeated Persian forces at the Granicus River, then at Issus. At Issus, he faced King Darius III himself. Darius fled, which haunted him. Alexander took Darius's family captive and treated them well because Alexander liked contrast. Mercy made him feel magnanimous. As he moved east, cities surrendered. Some resisted. Tyre resisted. So Alexander besieged it for 7 months, built a causeway, eventually took it, and then punished it. Again, not gently. But Alexander believed resistance was disrespect. After Tyre, he went to Egypt, and this is where things get mystical. The Egyptians welcomed him. They crowned him pharaoh. Alexander visited the Oracle of Siwa and came back convinced, fully convinced that he was the son of Zeus. Whether the oracle actually said that is unclear. What matters is that Alexander heard what he wanted. From this point on, Alexander wasn't just king, he was divine adjacent, which never causes problems. He founded a city there, Alexandria, because of course he did. And then he turned back east, because Persia was still there, and Darius was still alive, and Alexander did not like unfinished business. We'll float into that next, the slow march east, the exhaustion, the growing paranoia. But for now, just rest with this version of Alexander. Young, brilliant, certain. A man raised to believe the world was waiting for him, and one who never learned how to stop moving.
All right, let's ease back in. Same lowlights, same relaxed breathing. Alexander hasn't slowed down, but we absolutely can. When we last left him, he was in Egypt, being declared pharaoh, chatting with oracles, casually deciding he might be divine. which, to be fair, happens to a lot of people once no one around them is allowed to disagree. Alexander left Egypt refreshed, validated, and spiritually upgraded. He now believed very sincerely that he was chosen, not metaphorically, literally. And with that comforting thought tucked neatly into his mind, he marched east again, because the Persian Empire was still standing, and Darius III was still technically in charge of it. Technically. The decisive confrontation came in 331 BCE at the Battle of Gaugamela. This was supposed to be it, the big one. Darius had assembled a massive force: chariots, infantry, cavalry. Alexander's army was smaller, more compact, and frankly, very tired. But Alexander had something Persia did not: confidence and tactics. He charged directly toward Darius. Again, and again, Darius fled. At this point, Darius fleeing was becoming a theme. Alexander won, decisively. And just like that, the Persian Empire effectively collapsed. Alexander marched into Babylon, then Susa, then Persepolis. Cities opened their gates, treasuries were emptied. Alexander now controlled more wealth than anyone in the Greek world had ever seen. And this is where the shift begins. Up until now, Alexander was a conqueror, focused, driven, still in some way trying to prove himself. Now he was an emperor, and emperors get ideas. In Persepolis, Alexander burned the palace of Xerxes. Some say it was revenge for Persian invasions of Greece. Some say he was drunk. Some say he regretted it immediately. All of these things can be true at the same time. What matters is that this moment marked a change. The conquering was no longer just about strategy. It was about symbolism. Alexander began adopting Persian customs, Persian clothing, Persian court rituals. He wanted to rule the Persians, not just defeat them. This did not sit well with his Macedonian companions. They had followed him as a king, a general, a fellow Greek. Now he was bowing, wearing robes, and expecting proskynesis, ritual obeisance, which felt awkward. Alexander insisted this was necessary, that blending cultures was the future, that he was building something bigger than Macedonia. His soldiers nodded, but quietly, resentment grew. Alexander also began to drink more. This is important. Heavy drinking was common, but Alexander's temper, already sharp, became unpredictable. One night, during a drunken argument, Alexander killed Clitus the Black. Clitus had saved Alexander's life in battle. He was a loyal officer, but he criticized Alexander's Persian affectations. Alexander reacted violently, and then immediately collapsed in grief. He locked himself away, refused food, cried, because Alexander was not a sociopath. He was emotional, intense, prone to extremes. He demanded loyalty, but also affection, and he did not handle criticism well. As the campaign continued eastward, the distances grew longer, the terrain harsher. Alexander marched into Central Asia, Bactria, Sogdiana. This was not glamorous conquest. This was mountains, deserts, endless resistance. Local leaders did not surrender politely. They hid. They rebelled. Alexander responded with relentless campaigns. At some point, conquest became routine. Another city, another march, another Alexander. He married Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman. This surprised his Macedonian companions, but it fit his vision: unification, fusion. Also, she was young, and Alexander had a habit of making impulsive, emotional decisions. Roxana was reportedly strong-willed, which means she was perfect for him. Back home, or rather far behind him, Alexander's administration struggled. His empire was huge. His control was personal. When he wasn't present, things frayed, which meant he couldn't stop moving. He executed officials, replaced them, doubted everyone. Paranoia crept in. Some of it was justified. Plots did exist, but Alexander began seeing threats everywhere. Philotas, son of his trusted general Parmenion, was accused of conspiracy. He was tortured, executed. Parmenion, who had served Philip and Alexander loyally for decades, was executed too, just in case. Alexander couldn't afford uncertainty, or so he told himself. His inner circle shrank. The tone changed. By the time Alexander reached India, his army was exhausted. They had marched for years, fought countless battles, seen climates they were not prepared for. They faced King Porus at the Hydaspes River. Porus fought with elephants. Alexander won, barely. And afterward, he treated Porus with respect, because Alexander admired strength. But when he wanted to push further east, his army finally said no. They refused to march. This was unprecedented. Alexander sulked, stayed in his tent, refused to speak. Eventually, he gave in. They would go back, but not easily. The return march was brutal, through the Gedrosian desert. Thousands died from heat, thirst, exhaustion. Alexander marched alongside his men, suffered with them, which is why they forgave him, somehow. By the time Alexander returned to Babylon, he was a changed man. Still young, still ambitious, but worn. He planned new campaigns, Arabia, the West. He reorganized his empire, married off his officers to Persian women. He dreamed big. And then his body failed him. In 323 BCE, after days of fever and weakness, Alexander died. He was 32. No clear air, no instructions, just silence. His empire fractured immediately. Generals fought, territories split. The man who had never stopped moving was finally still, and history took a breath. We'll drift next into the aftermath, the legacy, the strange afterlife of a man who never learned how to rest.
All right, let's sink back into it. Slow pace, loose thoughts, because Alexander is gone now. And when someone like that disappears, history doesn't explode, it sort of unravels. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, 32 years old, which is unfair, but also very on brand for people who believe sleep is optional and destiny has deadlines. He had no clear successor. This is important and also deeply inconvenient. He technically had a half-brother, Philip III Aridius, who had cognitive impairments and was not exactly emperor material. And Roxana was pregnant, but the child wasn't born yet. So when Alexander's generals gathered around his body and asked who should rule, someone reportedly asked Alexander who he left the empire to. His answer? To the strongest. Which sounds cool and is also the worst possible estate plan. Immediately, everything became complicated. Alexander's death didn't end his empire, it exposed it. The thing about Alexander's rule is that it was intensely personal. He didn't build strong institutions, he built loyalty. And loyalty, it turns out, does not survive death very well. His generals, called the diadochi, which means successors because historians like naming things, quickly began carving up the empire. There were alliances, betrayals, wars, lots of wars. Ptolemy took Egypt, Seleucus took large chunks of Asia. Antigonus tried to take everything and failed. Cassander took Macedonia. Philip III was made king in name only, then murdered. Alexander's infant son, Alexander IV, technically inherited the throne, then also murdered, because again, no one planned this part. Roxana herself was eventually killed, which is grim but not surprising. Alexander's bloodline ended quietly, which is ironic given how loudly he lived. Meanwhile, Alexander's body became its own problem. His corpse was supposed to be taken back to Macedonia for burial, but Ptolemy intercepted it because having Alexander's body was politically useful. He took it to Egypt, eventually to Alexandria, and Alexander became a relic. People visited his tomb, paid respects, borrowed legitimacy. Roman emperors would later come and stare at it thoughtfully, which feels appropriate. Alexander was no longer a man. He was an idea, and ideas are harder to kill. Over the next centuries, Alexander's reputation grew. He was mythologized almost immediately. Stories spread, exaggerations multiplied. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a philosopher king, a civilizer, a hero. Never mind the destruction or the paranoia, or the fact that he executed friends and relatives. History tends to sand down the edges. Alexander became the Great, which is a title no one ever gave him while he was alive. He inspired legends in Greece, Persia, Egypt, India. Each culture adopted him. In some stories he was wise, in others cruel, in others divine. Medieval romances turned him into a knight. Islamic traditions identified him with Zulkarnain. Europe turned him into a model ruler. Everyone wanted a piece because Alexander didn't belong to one place anymore. He belonged to history. But let's drift back to the person beneath the legend, because the real Alexander is quieter. He was a man who never felt secure, who grew up competing with a father's shadow and a mother's expectations. He needed admiration, validation, movement. Stopping meant thinking. Thinking meant doubt. So he marched. He demanded loyalty, but struggled with intimacy. He trusted deeply, and then suddenly not at all. He wanted unity, but ruled through force. He believed in destiny, but never quite knew where it would end. There's a question historians like to ask. What if Alexander had lived longer? Would he have stabilized the empire, created institutions, learned to rest? Maybe. Or maybe his empire would have fractured anyway. Because Alexander was not a builder, he was a catalyst. He changed the world by colliding with it. Hellenistic culture spread across vast regions. Greek language, art, and ideas blended with local traditions. Cities flourished, trade expanded. In that sense, Alexander succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. But personally, he died young, without closure, without peace. The man who conquered everything never conquered his own restlessness, and that's something very human. Alexander's story works so well as a bedtime narrative because it never truly resolves. There's no final lesson neatly wrapped up, just momentum. A reminder that brilliance and exhaustion often travel together, that ambition burns brightly and briefly, that empires built on one person's will tend to collapse when that will disappears. So, as we gently settle into the quiet after Alexander, let's leave him there, not as a god, not as a myth, but as a tired young man who ran faster than history could keep up, and finally had to stop. That's enough for tonight. Let the world go unconquered for a while.